we had individuals who were cultural practitioners. We had litigants who were suing the Army. We had veterans. We had hunters. We had lineal descendants. We had business people. We had students. And then we had military personnel.
Welcome to Richard Hawes' YouTube channel, which looks at what we can do today to make Hawaii Island a more sustainable place to live so our children and grandchildren and their grandchildren won't be priced out of here and will be able to stay in Hawaii and live good lives here. Today, we are talking with Noelani Kalipi. Welcome, Noi.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Richard.
Noelani is a Hilo High School graduate who went on to earn a law degree from George Washington University Law School. As a college student, she interned for Senator Dan Akaka, and she is president of Kalipi Enterprises, a consulting firm specializing in systems planning, energy security, community empowerment, and helping communities to create and implement courageous space for difficult and emotionally charged discussions that are related to land use, ancestral knowledge and indigenous rights, economic development, and access to capital. And that is a perfect lead into a project that she's involved in right now, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But first, Richard, you two have known each other for a long time. Tell us how you know Noi.
I don't
You don't know?
remember exactly. It seems like I've known her forever. I guess the first time we started working together was when we were looking into purchasing the electric utility.
We first met in working on the Kāhoahoa initiative when there was an effort to try to buy Hawaiian Electric. I think this was back in 2010, maybe. Richard was on the board and I was also recruited to serve on the board. And we were really just looking at, how do we help with Hawaii's energy independence future, and how do we do it in a way that keeps electricity affordable for Hawaii residents. The regulated model for electricity and the utility was very different back then from what it is now, and I can say that I'm hopeful that our work resulted and contributed to where everything is currently.
Richard, you're working with Noi in the Kāhoahoa program, which is what we're talking about today. I want to talk a little bit more about that. Noi, first, would you tell us about that program? What is that program and what is its mission?
So the Kāhoahoa Process is a community-based dialogue between Hawaii residents and Army personnel. I want to make sure people understand that I am speaking as a Hawaii Island resident, former military legislative assistant for Senator Akaka, former Army JAG Corps officer, and as a veteran, but specifically as a Native Hawaiian who lives on this island with a lot of family and cares about the future of Hawaii Island. I am not speaking on behalf of the Department of Defense. I am not speaking on behalf of the Department of the Army. I don't have any authority to do either as it pertains to the Kāhoahoa process and this interview. It was started back in 2020, where a group of us had been talking about really what do we need to do to reset the relationship between Hawaii Island residents and the Army so that we can come together, collaborate, and talk about the future of all of Pohakuloa. But Kāhoahoa is intended to talk about all of it and not just the state-leased lands, and to really talk about the future between Hawaii Island residents and the Army.
Is a lease coming up soon? Is that what you're referring to?
Out of the 130,000 acres that make Pohakuloa training area, there's about 24,000 acres of land that are leased from the state of Hawaii. And those leases are coming up for renewal in 2029. But Kāhoahoa is about all of Pohakuloa, not just the state leased lands.
And how did that get started?
That got started in conversations about 6 years prior to that. It actually took us 6 years to get it even going to the point of having meetings. A group of us, just different individuals, but also individuals who had been interested in the military and Hawaii Island residents, kind of got together and said, what would it take to start a community dialogue? And the key thing to understand is Kāhoahoa itself is still very much a pilot, right? Notwithstanding how we've been all working at it, it's still in very much so beginning phases, just because we're doing it from scratch. Often historically, the military would call a meeting if the military needed to share with community, or community would ask the military if there was an issue. We wanted to create a space where there was an ongoing dialogue, right? And so the idea was to put a process together where we started with creating, quote, the rules of engagement for engagement, right? Everyone understands that some of the topics are very emotional given the history of Hawaii, given land use, given differences of perspectives over how lands are used here. And we wanted to identify shared values, which we refer to as kapu, and rules for how we hold the space for discussions, especially when they get difficult. And that is what we've called the kanawai. And that was the first phase, and really co-designing how do we create that together.
Oh, that's so interesting. And tell us about the name Kāhoahoa.
So the name Kāhoahoa, the process was facilitated by three of us, myself, Mahina Paishan, and Kekuhi Kanahele. And the name Kāhoahoa came to Kekuhi, and she called us and she said, this is the name. Kāhoahoa has several meanings. There's one meaning to strike and to bind. Another is hoa is my friend, to come together. So that's the binding, right? And it's really kind of coming together, binding, and creating process together, in for lack of a better term. We actually did a lot of the hardest work on this and just creating the space over a 6-week period over Zoom, where we had Hawaii Island residents and members from the military participating, getting to know each other in 3 to 4 hour discussions every Thursday for 6 weeks.
Those are long discussions.
When we were originally putting the groups of participants together, we did a number of invites, and some people decided not to participate because it was too uncertain. Richard was one of the people who was willing to jump in and to do it. I thought he would be most interested because he's a veteran, right? So we had individuals who were cultural practitioners, we had litigants who were suing the Army, we had veterans, we had hunters, we had lineal descendants, we had business people, we had students, and then we had military personnel.
That's an amazingly impressive description of who you've invited. It sounds very thorough and complete, and all the people who have the interests. That's impressive. How many people are a part of this group?
You know, it's only about 40 people at this point. We're, again, in early stages. The intention of how this process was designed was really to look at how do we bring people together and how do we create the pathways to have discussions and hopefully identify collaborative solutions to the challenges and obstacles that people see in terms of what the future of Pōhakuloa looks like, right? And what I mean by the future, I mean, we have national security issues. There's live fire training and requirements for the Army to be the force that it needs to be, right? Pōhakuloa is also used by all of the other services, including the National Guard. At the same time, there's stewardship of natural resources, there's understanding cultural significance, there's access, there's just a plethora of issues where first breaking down the silos so people can share information and get the real facts of everything is important. But then when people identify challenges about how certain lands are being used and or how things are happening, we can come together to talk about the why, see if there's any shared vision moving forward, and identify potential timelines. I don't think it's realistic to say it's yes or no, you're in or you're out in terms of the future of the military in Hawaii. But I do think it's realistic, for example, to talk about generationally, what are we looking at? Like in Hawaii, we look at 7 generations ahead, 7 generations behind, right? So what's the timeline look like? Can we say in 200 years, you will need the same footprint that you have? Hopefully technology will have changed. Hopefully geopolitics will have changed. And if we are going to agree that there's going to be some point of an exit, then how might we prepare for that and walk backwards? And at that, we get to the specifics, but it's going to be a much longer time period than a lease. It's going to be a much longer time period than any of us know, and or maybe it won't be, but we need to talk about it.
That's really interesting. So you're putting something into play that might go beyond one lifetime, which is really significant and important, because if you're starting over all the time, that doesn't work very much.
Right.
Richard, you had talked about a meeting recently where you broke into groups based on specific interests. What kind of group are you going to be working with? What is your interest?
I volunteered to talk about why water, because I know Don Thomas and I've known him for a long time. He is a geologist from the University of Hawaii Manoa, and he's probably the most expert person about that subject in Hawaii. Don and I go way back.
Is he a part of this project as well?
I had a conversation with him several days ago, and he has some personal issues he needs to take care of. But when the time is right, he'll be helping us put this together.
Let me give you a sense of how the phases work. So the first phase was really seeing, could we come together? Could we identify shared values and the rules of engagement for how we maintain the space for dialogue, right? And I'm happy to say we were able to, right? And our shared values are Aina, Aloha, Ohana, and Malama Aina. And then we have 7 kanawai for how we hold the space. And as an example, one of those kanawai is state your non-negotiables early. So as an example, we can be having a discussion and someone can say, I'm using kanawai 7, which we all know is to state your non-negotiables. They can say, I don't agree with anything coming out of your mouth. And I don't want my silence to ever be misconstrued as agreement or complicity. And I'm not going to agree with what you are saying, right? It's not personal, it's about what is being said, right? And I just want everyone to know that. And so by saying that and putting that non-negotiable on the table, that allows the individual to then say, okay, now that everybody understands my silence should not be misconstrued for agreement or complicity, I will listen actively. So we have a number of those kinds of rules, right, to set the space. What we did after that is then we decided, okay, now that we have the space, what is it that we want to talk about? So we started by identifying what are potential issues of discussion. And we also talked about what makes them hard to talk about. Is it the hierarchy? Is it the imbalance of authority? Is it the lack of understanding? You know, all of those issues. And once we had addressed that, we eventually got to a point where, given the shared values and our connection to place, what bonded everybody together was every single person had a connection to Pohakuloa. Whether it was from when we drive across Saddle and we look at it, whether it was if we train there, whether it was if we do cultural protocols there, whether or not if we were lineal descendants, everyone there had a connection to land and to place. And out of that love and connection, that's what brings us together. So out of that came the idea of co-stewardship or co-management. What could it look like? Now, that's a very unpopular concept for a federal agency to entertain. Luckily, we had military leaders that said, let's explore what that could look like. This was 3 years ago. This was way before it was cool to say co-management or co-stewardship, right? And we're still defining it. But under that broad title, we then created working groups, right? The group decided what are the 4 areas we want to work on. So one was law and process, one was community engagement, one was why, and one was stewardship. And out of all of the discussions that occurred, it kept coming back to water, because water is the source of everything. And at the time, there were being discussions held about water as part of the stewardship of Mauna Kea with what was happening with the Mauna Kea working group. And there was a desire to begin to address the need for potable drinking water at Pōhakuloa, because the Army trucks its potable water up and puts it in the water tanks, right? So there's significant costs. And Dr. Thomas had done some testing, some water testing separately. And so one of the cultural practitioners very wisely said, before we talk about any uses, can we please all get together and talk about how we see the water table and the water cycle, so that all of the perspectives about that water cycle can be brought together, so that we at least have an understanding of how people see it from a Western science perspective, as well as an indigenous perspective and any other perspective that is there, so that if and when there are proposed uses of water near and around Pohakuloa, we'll start with a baseline of understanding, so everyone will understand where we're coming from. So that's a key example of how this process works. So we've had one water summit to start that discussion. We're going to have another one, and the VI group will be working on that. Similarly, the other working groups are identifying additional topics that they would like to talk to, not just because it's a topic, but because things are happening that they're very interested in. And our focus on water was before Red Hill. So then after Red Hill, it became even more of a need. And we delayed our discussions until Red Hill was somewhat addressed.
And will you just give us a short 1-paragraph description of what happened with Red Hill on Oahu for people who don't know?
Sure. For a number of years or decades, actually, the Navy had fuel tanks in Red Hill, which is an area on Oahu. And these were very large tanks of jet fuel for operations. And there was a leak of the fuel that got into nearby drinking water, and it became a very big issue of having jet fuel in drinking water that resulted in people being evacuated from their homes, and essentially has resulted in the Navy draining the fuel tanks, finding another solution for its storage requirements for operational needs. And the cleanup is not yet complete, but the fuel tanks have been drained.
This is fascinating, the way you're approaching all of this. I think it's so interesting to hear about. We don't hear about these kinds of discussions and work that really does bring in all the people who are involved. It's such a broad approach. I think that's fascinating. Richard, what do you think about it?
Oh, yeah, that's what gets my attention, considering everybody's point of view, looking for what's good for the future and respecting each other, and not taking it personally. But then at the same time, being able to say, listen, my being quiet doesn't mean I necessarily agree. I really am impressed and I feel real comfortable in this whole situation. And a high respect for the people that are organizing, and Mahina Paishania was working with you, Noe. Boy, she's really good at what she does. It really makes people feel comfortable. And the military people, they don't use their ranks, One guy I was talking to on the side, I found out later he was a general. So what that means is you're leaving, that part where some people feel intimidated that, oh, I'm a brigadier general so-and-so. That's not how this whole thing operates. It's more like the process.
Titles are not allowed in the room. We realize everyone has earned their title and their rank, but in our room, because of the imbalance of authority as a key component of making it tough to talk about these issues, and because it impacts our ability to just have discussions, we all agreed as a baseline when we started that it's first names, and we don't lead by I'm so-and-so and I'm the CEO of this company. We don't lead by I'm, so-and-so and I'm a general or a colonel or a sergeant or a sergeant major, right? It's just, I'm Noi. This is Richard.
I'm wondering, why do you think military leaders are open to discussing co-management, as you mentioned?
The biggest part of national security is taking care of people and taking care of place, which is very aligned with what we believe and what we see. And I can't speak for Army. I'm not a part of the Army, but in my experience, Army really cares for its people and the places that it is, right? And Hawaii is significant. Now, to that point, I do have a position as a volunteer. I've been appointed to serve as a civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army, which is a volunteer unpaid position where I help to connect the Secretary to community. But I actually got that position after we started Kāhoahoa. So it was ironic that it was helpful. So I just wanted to share that. My view in working with Army officials is that they care deeply, right? And they want to be able to speak and interact with people.
Yeah, that's great. What are the next steps?
So one of the things is that we had to start someplace. So everybody always says, well, I wasn't invited and I wasn't a part of this. Correct. And we take accountability, and it's not an exclusive process, but we do have to come together as a group and determine how do we expand, right? So we're in the process of really ramping up our convening, identifying the topics, identifying who else is interested in those topics and needs to be invited. And then most importantly, how do we onboard people, right? Because it's about the process. How do we explain the shared values and the extensive time we spent working on them? How do we explain the kanawai, the rules of engagement for how we engage, and how do we hold that space? Mahina Paishan moving forward will be the primary facilitator for Kāhoahoa. It's community-based, so that's challenging. We had a little bit of money that was sponsored to start it, but for the last 3 years, we've been doing it pro bono, and now we are seeking some additional funding to pay for some facilitation, but everyone is very sensitive to who pays, right? So we're in the process of exploring that and talking to people.
If you had to explain sort of like an ultimate goal of this process? Is there one sort of overarching way to put that?
I think the ultimate goal of the process is to really have a community-based dialogue that is run by community members so that the continuity in the process of the relationship between Hawaii Island and the military is held by the community. I think it's important for the community to run the dialogue because this is our island, this is our place. So the overarching part is to have a community-based dialogue run by Hawaii Island residents, open to the art of the possible in terms of the future of Pohakuloa, with additional outcomes of shared understanding, strengthening relationships, and collaborative solutions to begin to address things moving forward.
The process makes me feel really good because we're trying to get everybody together and especially have this discussion with a cultural background. You see how Noe speaks about it? There's a cultural background behind this. And so whatever I can do to contribute, I want to while I can.
I am very proud, for example, of how we facilitated the process. So, when we did the shared values, we had Hawaiian language speakers because we had part of our group is Olelo Hawaii and part is non-Hawaiian speaking, but we really did a deep dive on what words meant. So for our values, for example, for Aina, there's a slide that I'll share with you that has the word Aina in the middle, and then it's full of about 60 other words, because in all the different contexts, that's what Aina means, right? So part of the importance was to say, when you use this word, what is the context? What do you mean? Which goes to Richard's, the focus on culture and intention.
So do you mean that the 60 or so other words, are they alternate definitions of the word Aina, or what people were saying Aina means to them?
Both, because in the Hawaiian language, right, every word has 8 different meanings, but it's all contextual.
Yeah.
So we had some very deep discussions in choosing those words based on what those words meant to everyone in the group.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you for joining us today, Noe. That was truly very interesting hearing about Kāhoahoa, and good for you. I think it's amazing that you're doing projects like that. We should have many more projects like that. What an important thing you're doing. And thank you everyone for watching. We will be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Richard Ha's vlog. Ahui ho.